thinned out pretty quick. Let me just,
Oh, there we go.
it works. Just waiting for a little direction here.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, we'll get started. We'll make this brief. We started this conference with an inspiring talk on the importance of ideas in human development and human history. I'd like to end or come close to the end of this conference with a talk about the importance of ideas in a rather more mundane application. Some might even say boring, but it's important, and Jerry and I'd like to tell you why. For very good reason, our host did not start with this image, but it's really, despite the fact that it seems rather boring, it is very important. It's ideas about organizing people, in particular economists, at the Federal Communications Commission. We all know what the FCC does is important. They, along with the committees of jurisdiction in Congress, work on communications policy, technology policy. This is the technology policy conference and at TPI. Well, if what the FCC does is important, it's important to talk about how it does its work. And economists play a very important role in that. And to the extent anyone thinks or happens to think that economists are boring, they weren't listening to our guest speaker at dinner last night, nor have they ever had the opportunity to have dinner while seated next to Jerry Fallhaber or Tom Hazlett or Deirdre McCloskey. You would no longer think economists are boring. So we've established that this is important work. One of the images I use to tell a story to economists when we're talking to economists at the commission is we're talking about how you do your work, how you're organized, what authorities you have, and why is that important. It sounds like we're just arranging people in an org chart. Why does anyone care? Well, to the extent you organize people effectively so that they can do their work well, they can advise on public policy and produce or help guide the production of better public policy. And why is that important? Because better public policy is going to either, some would say, advance the public interest, advance the mission of the FCC, in some way, shape, or form, create better value to the public. So this is what I say when I'm talking to economists of the commission about why we are having this conversation. So what is it that economists do at the Federal Communications Commission? They work on transactions, mergers, and other kinds of transactions, very similar to the work that's done at FTC and DOJ's antitrust division, and frequently, almost always, on the big mergers, working very closely with those folks. Economists also work in the design of auctions, and economists work on rulemakings, policy matters before the commission. So what's the problem? Well, the chairman gave a speech in April this year. We're now to August. In April, at the speech, he outlined a few issues about the use of economics at the commission. And we'll tick off these problems. The idea is to better incorporate economic analysis in the work of the commission. And so some of the problems the chairman mentioned in his speech, to just cite them. One, economists are not systematically incorporated. When I mentioned the three roles of economists, and there are actually more, but the three big areas in which economists work, in transactions, economists are pretty well incorporated. They're used pretty darn well. In auction design, same thing. Economists are used pretty well, incorporated pretty systematically. Within rulemakings, it's a bit more idiosyncratic. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So there's an opportunity to better include economists, consistently include their role in rulemakings before the FCC. Economists work in silos. Most of the economists at the commission are in policy-making bureaus, and they work in different areas. Communication across those bureaus and the economists across those bureaus is not as good as it could be. They could learn from each other, perhaps under different arrangements. So there's an opportunity for economists to perhaps work a little bit less in silos. Cost-benefit analysis is not used quite as much as it could be at the commission on a lot of policy-making matters. And data, the chairman also mentioned data in his speech. There's a tremendous amount of data in the commission in all kinds of, they're not closets, they're online, they're in files, but it's not systematically organized, and there are opportunities to use it better, to better guide our policy making. So with that in mind, the chairman said he would like to establish an office of economics and data, the names to be determined, but then an office of economics within the FCC. He established a working group. I'm a part of that working group. The working group has been working since April to come up with recommendations for the chairman on how to address some of these concerns at the commission. So what have we been doing as part of the working group? One, we've been having interviews inside the FCC, within the policymaking bureaus. We've talked to all the leadership. We've also had interviews, meetings with the economists and relevant staff within the policymaking bureaus at the FCC. In addition, we've had interviews with former FCC officials, former chief economists, former chiefs of staff, Republicans and Democrats, Republican and Democratic administrations both, people who could advise us on the organization of economic analysis within the FCC. We've been talking to other agencies as well, FTC, FDA, EPA, the list goes on, OMB, about how we could better organize the economists within the commission. And we've also looked at people who've written about this, thought about this. There's not a huge literature on the organization of economists within government agencies, but we have been looking at that. Don't have any major announcements for today as to what the office is going to look like or the structure, but I can tell you some of the takeaways that we've given the chairman in terms of here's what we've learned since April. First of all, there are trade-offs. There are trade-offs between economists being well integrated within policymaking bureaus and economists having a certain amount of independence. And when you think about the structure of an organization like the FCC and where the economists are housed and how they are used, these trade-offs have to be seriously considered. Another big takeaway we've had in talking with other agencies is a certain amount of independence of the economists is needed. The economists could be positioned in different ways in the commission. They're positioned in different ways in different agencies. But at some level, in some way, shape, or form, economists need to be able to have a certain amount of influence, certain amount of independence, to say, a particular rule that's under consideration has these concerns. The economic analysis needs to be like this. These kinds of issues need to be seen, understood by the political decision makers, by the commissioners and chairmen, because they are the ones who are ultimately going to decide whether or not a rule is established. Only other thing I would add is kind of where we're going. The organization of the new office will reflect what we've learned and ultimately the chairman's cuts on where the economists should sit, how they should have their reporting arrangements, and what authorities they should have. We also, in looking at what's been done before and what's been done in other agencies, we understand that there's a particularly high degree of value that could be had from better incorporating cost-benefit analysis or regulatory impact analysis in the rulemakings that the commission does. And so we're thinking about how to do that. And to talk about the value of regulatory impact analysis, I'm going to turn it over to Jerry, who has a significant amount of experience at looking at other agencies and how they've done it.
Okay, yeah, I'll just spend a couple of minutes explaining why this analysis matters, why it's hopefully a good idea and worth putting a little more effort into. The value of having an outside academic is coming into an agency is I can take a more philosophical approach, and it turns out Calvin explained this quite nicely a number of years ago. This is the Calvin and Hobbes cartoon that explains the importance of regulatory impact analysis. If you're having trouble reading it from where you sit, particularly over at this end of the room, I can summarize. Calvin says, I'm going to prove there is no moral law governing the universe. I'll throw this water balloon at Susie unless the universe gives me a sign that it would be wrong. And he counts down, he gets no sign, he throws the water balloon, she chases him, beats him up. And in the last panel, he's lying on the ground in pain saying, "Why does the universe always give you the sign after you do it?" And that's the fundamental reason that we want to have regulatory impact analysis to inform regulatory decisions, because we want to understand the consequences of regulatory choices before we do it, rather than have it come back to bite us later after we do it. Now, this is not, there are a lot of things that can be done in a regulatory impact analysis, but over time, both scholars and folks in government have identified really four key attributes that ought to be in there. One is analysis of the problem that the agency is trying to solve. Not just a statement of the problem or an assertion of a problem, but rather some empirical demonstration that the problem is real, that it is significant, and an assessment of what actually caused it. Was it a market failure in the classic sense? Is it some sort of a failure of government institutions? Or is it some other thing that policymakers regard as an important problem, even if it doesn't have much to do with a failure of markets or governments to produce the efficient outcome? But some kind of assessment of, what's the problem we're trying to solve and what caused it, so that we can then try to develop some effective solutions. Oh, we have a... Okay, secondly, development of alternative possible solutions. This is not just benefit-cost analysis of a proposed regulation, but rather, before we even get into choosing, let's develop alternative possible solutions and then look at the benefits and the costs of each of the possible alternatives. Contrary to some folks' popular belief in Washington, the idea of doing regulatory impact analysis was not some goofy thing dreamed up by right-wing Republicans. It has a long bipartisan history enshrined in executive orders, really going back to President Jimmy Carter. This is the Mount Rushmore of executive orders on regulatory impact analysis, where it was the Carter executive order that first used the term regulatory impact analysis, or regulatory analysis, and said that agencies ought to be stating the problem they're trying to solve and doing an economic analysis of alternatives. And those basic principles have carried through on all of the other executive orders since then. The only reason that the two Bushes aren't on there is that President G.H.W. Bush just continued under Reagan's executive order 122291. President G.W. Bush continued under the Clinton executive order EO 12866. The most interesting executive order, perhaps for our purposes, is the last one listed under President Obama, Executive Order 13579. These executive orders have applied to executive branch agencies. No president has yet been audacious enough to try to apply them to independent agencies, but President Obama did issue 13579, which basically asked independent agencies to regulate in compliance with the principles in EO 12866 to the extent that they can under law. So that was definitely not a you must do this, but it was a hey guys, this is a good idea, you really should do this. Why should the FCC try to take the lead in this? Well, baseball fans may remember the old joke about the old Washington Senators, that Washington's first in war, first in peace, last in the American League. Well, the FCC is, by some measures, first in regulation, at least among independent agencies, so we ought to be first in regulatory analysis as well. This is some data from a source called RegData, which counts the number of restrictions in the code of federal regulations. Restrictions are words like shall, must, may not, and so forth. And it's one way of quantifying the amount of regulation. Is it perfect? No. Is it more accurate than counting page numbers? Probably. And what this shows is that for a good while, among independent regulatory agencies, the Federal Communications Commission, second from the bottom, has had more restrictions in the Code of Federal Regulations than any other independent agency. And I checked with the folks who produced the chart, and the other agencies down at the bottom, that's not concealing some other big agency, that is just a whole bunch of other smaller miscellaneous agencies. So on this, the FCC is clearly the champ. Now, I mentioned that the principles of regulatory impact analysis really kind of reflect a bipartisan consensus that presidents of both parties have endorsed over the years, where you can find the same kind of a bipartisan consensus at the Federal Communications Commission. Because after President Obama issued Executive Order 13579, Chairman Genachowski issued a memo, an internal memo to FCC staff saying, okay guys, we're going to implement this thing, and here's the kind of things we want to do in order to comply as best we can with President Obama's request. The primary difference between what Chairman Pai is proposing to do and what Chairman Genachowski was doing is not a difference in the principles for analysis, but rather, this initiative that Wayne described is an attempt to try to make some lasting structural changes that'll institutionalize better economic analysis and greater influence of economic analysis in decisions going forward. And I guess with that, we can stop for questions. Oh, sorry. Oh, wait. Okay, we've got some mics. Sorry, we took you by surprise.
All right, so a quick question, maybe not such a quick answer. What's the difference between a regulatory impact analysis and what the Commission should be doing in any one of its policy proceedings?
What's the difference between a regulatory impact analysis and what the Commission should be doing?
If you look at it, remembering this slide, it basically said you should look at costs and benefits and think about what the alternatives are, and are you solving an actual problem? Presumably that's what the FCC is supposed to be doing with its regulations. I mean, so what are all the attorneys doing if the economists are figuring out what the optimal policy is?
Well, I think you've just presented a reason why, another reason why this is a good idea. Yeah, and sometimes when I do presentations on regulatory impact analysis, I'll refer to it as, decision-making 101, that in some sense, this isn't a uniquely economic framework. This is kind of what you would think you would want to do to make any major decision, whether it's in your life or whether it's about a regulation, that, understand what the problem is, look at alternatives, and, somehow weigh the pros and cons of the alternatives.
You could think of it as systematizing and formalizing to some extent. It's not like no questions have ever been asked before. Of course, that's not the case. And it should also be pointed out that to the extent a formal regulatory impact analysis is handed to the chairman and commissioners saying, here are the costs and benefits of option A, B, and C, even if option C clearly outweighs, the net benefits clearly outweigh option B and A, that doesn't mean the chairman and the commissioners are in any way bound to pursue option C. It's guiding them and saying, here are different evaluations of different policy choices you're considering. You should consider this to inform your decision making while weighing whatever other factors you think are important.
Thanks, guys. Great presentation. Just curious, the executive orders that you outlined have a pretty common principle of publishing the regulatory impact analyses so that the public can comment on their form and substance. Do you anticipate making that recommendation at the FCC so the public can see the full benefit of your analysis?
It's still in play how, and ultimately, of course, be the chairman's call as to what kind of structure this would include. So you can imagine a regulatory impact analysis being part of a NOI, notice of inquiry, or a notice of proposed rulemaking, NPRM, or some other stage along the way. And how and what form it takes, that is yet to be determined.
Yeah, the kind of standard way they do it in the executive branch is have a draft with the NPRM, and some agencies will do an advance notice of proposed rulemaking with some kind of an initial draft in it as well.
Jonathan Meg from Communications Daily. Question for either of you. I know you said the specifics of the Office of Economics at the FCC haven't been worked out. Just pushing for any clarity you can provide on timing of your group finishing work, of starting the office. In fact, even of the procedural way in which the FCC itself, whether it's staff or commissioners, authorized the creation of a new office. I'm sure it's happened before, but don't know what the process is. Thanks.
Just at a real high level, we are wrapping up our work as a working group this summer and providing some information, some recommendations to the chairman. From there, he will make some decisions, obviously reaching out to the other commissioners. There's a process whereby the chairman would reach out to the appropriate committees on the Hill. As far as timing goes, there's no public announcement as to the new office will be set up at any particular time. It would be reasonable to expect that maybe towards the end of this year or the beginning of next year, the commission might be in a position to take some action.
Thanks.
Sure.
School from Politico. Do you expect this office to have any impact or any role in the current open internet order proceedings?
Jerry is working on the open internet order, internet freedom order, and I am not, so I'm going to let Jerry speak to that.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's kind of hard to say because the office doesn't exist yet, so, yeah, there
An
are...
informal sort of, like this approach, are you integrating into the sort of the ongoing proceeding?
Well, if you look at the NPRM for the Internet Freedom Proceeding, there is a section on benefit cost analysis that's quite consistent with the principles described in these executive orders, and so yeah, that's certainly getting some thought. And more generally with rulemakings, as on one path is the discussion of how to set up this office and so forth, but at the FCC, I mean, the chief economist and other economists have always been involved to one extent or another in rulemakings, and so that continues along the kind of track it's continued along before, while plans are being laid to create this new office.
Okay. One quick follow-up, just any expectation of how big it'll be? How many people? How much staff?
That's to be determined as well. So we're definitely looking at all the economists across the commission and the work they do and where they sit and to whom they report and all those things. Everyone is being considered, and how it should be structured, that's all on the table right now.
Thank you.
Richard Bennett, of the 20 million comments that have been filed in the Restoring Internet Freedom docket, how many have been helpful to developing a regulatory impact analysis?
I'm not working on this item, and Jerry is, so I'll let him comment.
Yeah, I can't comment that specifically on an ongoing proceeding.
Have you read them all? Have you read all 20 million? Or not? Okay.
No, but I think I can safely make another more general point based on my understanding of how the Administrative Procedure Act works and how federal agencies in general do this. The standard to which agencies are held for promulgating regulations is they have to have a kind of reasoned determination that explains why they're doing what they're doing. And the development of regulations under the APA is not supposed to be a poll or a popularity contest. And yet, I mean, not just at the FCC, but other agencies, you do see these contests to see who can file the most comments on both sides of an issue, many of which often say a lot of the same kind of things. But I mean, the most useful thing to a federal agency is comments that provide new data, new information, new analysis that we didn't have before.
So I'll say, just to tell you that our new scholar, Sarah O, is working on some machine learning tools to look at those 20 million comments, and so not to put any pressure on her, but she'll tell you in a few weeks. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
This will be a really interesting change to the FCC. And so lunch is immediately next door, and we'll also hear from Sam Arbesman's book, Overcomplicated, which will explain or discuss whether technology is too complicated for us to understand anymore.